The champagne bubbles caught the light as Mike raised his glass high above the crowd, his voice booming across the Grand Ballroom like he owned the world. To Creative Spark Marketing Solutions, he declared, that familiar smirk stretching across his face, and to finally being free to build something real without dead weight holding me back. The room erupted in polite applause, but I heard the underlying message loud and clear. Dead weight, that's what 4 years of marriage and building a business together had meant to him. I stood frozen near the back entrance, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles had gone white, watching my ex-husband celebrate what he believed was his greatest triumph over me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and 6 months ago I thought my life was over. I'm 34, a graphic designer who spent the better part of my 20s building what I thought was our dream together. I have a 15-year-old daughter, Rachel, who's smarter than both her parents combined, and until recently I believed that love and hard work could overcome anything. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was absolutely right about one thing that would change everything. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes the person who thinks they've won hasn't read the fine print. The Grand Ballroom at the Riverside Marriott was packed with everyone who mattered in our small business community. Local entrepreneurs, city council members, Chamber of Commerce representatives, and that reporter from the Riverside Business Journal who'd been following Mike's supposed success story. The crystal chandeliers cast everything in a warm golden glow, making the whole scene look like something out of a movie. A success story. A rags-to-riches tale of a man who'd overcome personal setbacks to build something extraordinary. Except the man giving the speech had never created anything in his life. Mike stood at the podium in his expensive navy suit, the one I'd helped him pick out 2 years ago for a client presentation that landed us our biggest contract. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile practiced and confident, and he gestured with the easy charm that had once made me fall in love with him. When I first envisioned Creative Spark Marketing Solutions, he continued, his voice carrying that tone of humble pride that made people lean in, I knew it would take sacrifice. I knew it would mean leaving behind relationships that weren't serving my vision. His eyes swept the crowd, landing briefly on Jessica Palmer, his 28-year-old girlfriend, who sat at the front table wearing a dress that cost more than most people's rent. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mike was accepting an award for Entrepreneur of the Year from the Riverside Chamber of Commerce, being celebrated for building a business that was thriving beyond anyone's expectation. Creative Spark Marketing Solutions had grown from a small design studio to a full-service marketing agency with 12 employees and clients throughout Southern California. The local newspaper had featured him on their cover last month with the headline, From Divorce to Success, Local Man Builds Marketing Empire. I'd seen the article, had even kept a copy, though I wasn't sure why at the time. What the audience didn't know, what Mike didn't know, what even Jessica Palmer with her perfectly contoured cheekbones didn't know, was that I was the one who'd created Creative Spark. Not the marketing solutions part, that was Mike's addition, but the original concept, the name, the brand identity, the foundational client relationships that had made everything else possible. I'd spent countless nights in 2019 sketching logos, researching competitors, crafting the perfect brand story for what I'd originally called Creative Spark Design Studio. I'd been the one who'd saved every penny to pay for the trademark registration, the one who'd filed all the paperwork, the one who'd built the initial client base through sheer determination and talent. The applause died down as Mike launched into his acceptance speech, talking about innovation and perseverance, and the importance of surrounding yourself with the right people. I watched him from my position near the emergency exit, close enough to hear every word but far enough away that I wouldn't cause a scene. I hadn't planned to come tonight. Sophia Martinez, my best friend and divorce attorney, had sent me the invitation as a joke, thinking it would give me closure to see Mike's moment of triumph. Sometimes you need to see the train wreck to know you jumped off the tracks in time, she'd said with that dry humor that had gotten me through the worst parts of the divorce. But standing there listening to Mike rewrite history, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger. Exactly. and not the crushing sadness that had been my constant companion since the divorce papers were signed. It was something sharper, something that made my spine straighten and my breathing steady. It was the feeling of watching someone celebrate a victory they hadn't earned, using words they hadn't written, accepting praise for work they hadn't done. Mike's mother, Patricia Thompson, sat at the table closest to the podium, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief like she was watching her son receive a Nobel Prize. Patty had never liked me, had always made it clear that she thought Mike was settling when he married me. "You're very talented, dear," she'd say in that voice that managed to make a compliment sound like an insult, "but Mike has such big dreams. I just hope you can keep up." She'd never said it directly, but I'd always felt like she was waiting for me to prove I wasn't good enough for her son. Tonight, watching her beam with pride at Mike's speech, I realized she probably thought she'd been right all along. The business Mike was being celebrated for looked nothing like what I'd originally created. Creative Spark Design Studio had been intimate, personal, focused on helping small businesses tell their stories through thoughtful design. I'd specialized in working with local restaurants, boutique shops, and service providers who needed someone who understood their community. Mike had transformed it into something bigger, flashier, more corporate. Creative Spark Marketing Solutions offered social media management, digital advertising, brand consulting, and strategic planning. It was successful, undeniably so, but it had about as much in common with my original vision as a chain restaurant has with a family recipe. Brad Collins, Mike's business partner and college roommate, stood up to offer a toast. Brad had been Mike's best man at our wedding, had spent countless evenings at our kitchen table helping Mike figure out how to scale the business I'd built. He was one of those guys who was perpetually optimistic, always talking about synergy and disruption and other buzzwords that made him sound smarter than he was. "To my partner Mike Thompson," Brad said, raising his glass toward the podium, "who had the vision to see what Creative Spark could become, and the courage to make the tough decisions that got us here, the tough decisions." I almost laughed out loud at that phrase. The tough decision to gradually push me out of client meetings, the tough decision to move business operations to a new office space, and conveniently forget to put my name on the lease, the tough decision to open new bank accounts and credit lines without my knowledge, the tough decision to file for divorce and claim that the business was primarily his contribution to the marriage. Mike had made plenty of tough decisions over the past 2 years, but none of them had taken any real courage. I remembered the day I'd first realized what was happening. It was a Tuesday in March, and I'd gone to the bank to make a deposit from our latest client payment. The teller, a woman I'd been working with for 3 years, had given me a confused look when I'd handed her the check. "I'm sorry, Miss Thompson," she'd said, glancing at her computer screen, "but this account has been flagged for signature verification. It looks like there have been some changes to the account permission." That was the first time I'd learned that Mike had been restructuring our business finances, moving money into accounts that only he could access. When I'd confronted him about it that evening, Mike had been ready with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. The accountant had recommended separating personal and business finances more clearly. The lawyer had suggested protecting business assets in case of any future liability issues. The bank had offered better terms for accounts with fewer signatories. Every explanation had been plausible, and Mike had delivered them with the kind of concerned sincerity that made me question whether I was being paranoid. Looking back now, I could see the pattern that had been invisible to me at the time. Mike hadn't decided to leave me and steal the business in some dramatic moment of betrayal. He'd been planning it methodically, carefully over the course of months. Every conversation about business structure, every suggestion about separating responsibilities, every decision about new hires and client relationships, had been part of a larger strategy to position himself as the indispensable founder and me as the replaceable employee. The speeches continued, each one adding another layer to the mythology of Mike's entrepreneurial success. The president of the Chamber of Commerce talked about Mike's innovative approach to client relations. A local business owner shared how Creative Spark Marketing Solutions had transformed her company's digital presence. A city councilman praised Mike's commitment to keeping jobs in Riverside instead of outsourcing to larger firms in Los Angeles or San Diego. Each testimonial was genuine, each speaker was sincere, and each word felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. What made it worse was that I was genuinely proud of what the business had become. The work was good, the clients were happy, and the employees Mike had hired were talented and dedicated. If he'd simply bought me out fairly, if he'd acknowledged my contributions and given me credit for the foundation I'd built, I might have been able to celebrate his success. Instead, he'd chosen to erase me from the story entirely, to pretend that Creative Spark Marketing Solutions had sprung fully formed from his imagination. Jessica Palmer caught my eye from across the room, and for a moment I thought she might recognize me. We'd never been formally introduced, but Riverside isn't that big a city, and the business community is even smaller. She tilted her head slightly like she was trying to place where she'd seen me before, then turned back to Mike with a bright smile. Jessica was everything I wasn't: young, glamorous, perfectly put together, and completely uninterested in the behind-the-scenes work that actually made businesses run. Mike had met her at a networking event 8 months ago, and she'd been his perfect accessory ever since. The thing about Jessica that bothered me most wasn't her age or her looks or even the way she hung on Mike's every word. It was how perfectly she fit into the narrative he'd constructed about his life. In Mike's version of events, he was a visionary entrepreneur who'd been held back by a wife who didn't share his ambition. Jessica, with her social media following, and her enthusiasm for the lifestyle that successful business ownership could provide, was proof that he'd been right to prioritize his dreams over his marriage. I checked my phone and saw that it was almost 9 o'clock. Rachel was spending the night at my sister's house, which meant I didn't have to rush home to help with homework or listen to teenage complaints about teachers and friends. I could stay and listen to the rest of Mike's celebration, could torture myself with more speeches about his incredible vision and determination, or I could leave, go home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget that any of this had ever happened. But something kept me rooted to that spot near the emergency exit. Maybe it was the same stubborn streak that had made me fight for joint custody when Mike's lawyer suggested I'd be better off with supervised visitation. Maybe it was the same instinct that had made me start my own business, Pixel Perfect Creative, instead of giving up on design work entirely. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that whispered that this story wasn't over yet. Mike was wrapping up his speech, thanking everyone for their support and promising that Creative Spark Marketing Solutions would continue to grow and serve the Riverside business community. The applause was enthusiastic. People were already starting to stand, and I knew that in a few minutes, the evening would dissolve into the kind of networking conversations that made events like this valuable for everyone except the person standing alone by the exit. As the crowd began to mill around, I saw Mike making his way through. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The congratulations and handshakes, Jessica by his side, accepting praise like a king holding court. He looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen him look in the last 2 years of our marriage. Part of me wanted to be angry about that, wanted to resent him for finding joy in something he'd stolen from me, but mostly I just felt tired. The exhaustion wasn't physical, though the emotional weight of the past 6 months had certainly taken its toll. It was the deeper weariness that comes from watching someone rewrite history while you're still living with the consequences of the truth. Mike's version of our story was clean, simple, and completely one-sided. In his telling, he was the ambitious entrepreneur who'd outgrown a marriage that was holding him back. I was the creative type who'd been good at the artistic stuff but hadn't understood the business side of things. What Mike didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn, was that I'd understood the business side perfectly. I'd been the one who'd researched trademark law, who'd filed the paperwork, who'd made sure every legal detail was handled correctly. I'd been the one who'd insisted on protecting our intellectual property, who'd paid the fees, who'd followed up on every renewal notice. Mike had been focused on the big picture, the networking, the client relationships, the exciting parts of business ownership. I'd been focused on the foundation, the legal structure, the boring but essential details that made everything else possible. Standing there in the Grand Ballroom, watching Mike accept congratulations for building something on a foundation I'd created, I realized that all those boring details might be more important than I'd ever imagined. Because while Mike had been busy celebrating his victory and planning his expansion, he'd made one crucial oversight. He'd assumed that because he'd won the divorce, because he'd gotten the business, because he'd convinced everyone that Creative Spark Marketing Solutions was his creation, that meant he actually owned it. But ownership isn't always about possession. Sometimes it's about paperwork, about legal documents filed in dusty government offices, about trademarks registered by someone who understood that the devil is always in the detail. And sometimes, the person who thinks they've won the game hasn't realized that someone else has been playing by different rules all along. The crowd was beginning to thin out, people gathering their coats and saying their goodbye. Mike was still holding court near the podium, but I could see that the evening was winding down. Soon, he'd go home to his McMansion with Jessica, probably open another bottle of champagne, and bask in the afterglow of his triumph. He'd wake up tomorrow morning, feeling like he'd finally proven something to the world, like he'd justified every decision he'd made over the past 2 years. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and headed toward the exit, but I paused at the door to look back one more time. Mike was laughing at something Brad had said, his arm around Jessica's waist, surrounded by people who believed in his success story. He looked like a man who had everything he'd ever wanted, who'd made all the right choices, who'd built something he could be truly proud of. He had no idea that in my purse I carried a folder containing documents that would change everything, documents that I'd been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right stage for the final act of this particular drama. Because Mike had been right about one thing in his speech tonight: sometimes you do have to make tough decisions, and sometimes you do have to be willing to sacrifice relationships that aren't serving your vision. The difference was, I'd learned to be very, very careful about the detail. The drive home from the Marriott took me through the heart of downtown Riverside, past the coffee shops and boutiques where I'd first pitched my design services 5 years ago. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalks, and I found myself taking the long way home, not quite ready to face the silence of my apartment. My hands were still shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, the adrenaline from seeing Mike's performance slowly wearing off and leaving behind something rawer, something that felt dangerously close to the grief I thought I'd finished processing. The Grand Ballroom had been decorated with white linens and gold accents, everything perfectly coordinated to create an atmosphere of success and sophistication. The centerpieces were arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus, elegant and expensive, the kind of details that someone with excellent taste and an unlimited budget would choose. I'd noticed Jessica's hand in the planning immediately, from the way the lighting had been adjusted to create the most flattering angles for photographs to the careful positioning of the Riverside Business Journal photographer to capture Mike's best side during his speech. The entire evening had felt like a carefully choreographed performance, every element designed to reinforce the narrative of Mike's triumph. The guest list had been curated to include everyone who mattered in the local business community, but also people who would amplify the story beyond Riverside. I'd recognized several faces from the Los Angeles marketing scene, potential clients and collaborators who could help Creative Spark Marketing Solutions expand into bigger markets. Even the timing of the event had been strategic, coinciding with the release of the Chamber of Commerce's annual business directory, ensuring maximum publicity for Mike's award. What struck me most about the whole production was how thoroughly I'd been erased from. This wasn't just a matter of Mike not mentioning me in his speech, which I'd expected. It was a complete rewriting of history that went far deeper than I'd imagined possible. The promotional materials for the event had described Creative Spark Marketing Solutions as Mike's brainchild, founded in 2022 when he decided to pursue his entrepreneurial dream. The timeline conveniently skipped over the 3 years when Creative Spark Design Studio had been building its reputation and client base under my direction. I'd spent the past 6 months trying to rebuild my life after the divorce, focusing on my new business and my relationship with Rachel, trying to convince myself that what Mike had done was just the cost of moving forward. But tonight had shown me something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Mike hadn't just taken the business and moved on with his life. He'd systematically eliminated any evidence that I'd ever been involved, creating a mythology around his success that positioned him as the sole creator of everything we'd built together. The real estate agent who'd sold our family home had been at the awards ceremony, and when she'd spotted me near the exit, she'd made a point of coming over to express her sympathy about the divorce. "It must be so hard to see Mike doing so well," she'd said, with the kind of false concern that people use when they want to seem caring while actually being cruel. "But I'm sure you'll find your way eventually. Not everyone is cut out for the business world." The implication was clear. Mike's success proved that he'd been the driving force behind our partnership, and my current circumstances proved that I'd been holding him back. That conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had crystallized something that had been bothering me for months. The narrative around our divorce had somehow become that Mike was the ambitious entrepreneur, and I was the artistic type who couldn't handle the pressure of running a real business. People who'd known us for years, who'd seen me in client meetings and business planning sessions, had apparently accepted this revision of our history without question. It was as if Mike's current success retroactively validated every claim he'd made about our marriage and partnership. The parking lot of my apartment complex was nearly empty when I finally pulled in, most of my neighbors already settled in for the night. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking up at the windows of my second-floor unit, trying to summon the energy to climb the stairs and face another evening alone with my thoughts. The apartment was nice enough, a modern 2-bedroom with decent lighting and enough space for Rachel to have her own room when she stayed with me, but it felt temporary in a way that our family home never had, like a placeholder for a life I was still figuring out how to live. Rachel had been staying with my sister Carmen tonight, which meant I didn't have to put on the brave face I usually wore around my daughter. Rachel was smart enough to know that the divorce had been harder on me than I like to admit, but I'd been working hard to shield her from the worst of my emotional struggle. She was 15, dealing with her own challenges of high school and adolescence, and she didn't need to carry the weight of my disappointment and anger on top of everything else. The folder in my purse felt heavier than it should have as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. I'd been carrying those documents around for 3 weeks, ever since my meeting with David Chen, the intellectual property attorney who'd helped me understand the legal implications of what Mike had done. David was younger than I'd expected when Sophia had referred me to him, probably not much older than 35, but he'd listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like my concerns were legitimate rather than the paranoid fantasies of a bitter ex-wife. David's office was located in a converted Victorian house near the University of California Riverside campus, and his approach to law seemed to match the unconventional setting. Instead of intimidating me with legal jargon and billable hour estimates, he'd walked me through the trademark database on his computer, showing me exactly what my registration covered and how it applied to Mike's current business operation. "This is actually pretty straightforward," he'd said, adjusting his glasses as he scrolled through the search results. "You own the trademark to Creative Spark, and his use of that name for commercial purposes, without your permission, is textbook infringement." But David had also explained why the case might be more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Mike could argue that he'd been using the name in partnership with me during our marriage, and that the divorce settlement had transferred business assets to him. He could claim that Creative Spark Marketing Solutions was sufficiently different from Creative Spark Design Studio to avoid infringement. He could even argue that my failure to enforce the trademark over the past year constituted abandonment of my right. "The thing is," David had said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of smile that suggested he enjoyed complex legal puzzles, "intellectual property law tends to favor the person who can prove they were the original creator. And based on what you've shown me, you have excellent documentation of your creative process and business development. The question isn't whether you have a case, the question is what you want to do with it." That question had been haunting me for weeks. What did I want to do with the power I'd discovered I still held? The obvious answer was to file a cease and desist order, force Mike to change his business name, and possibly pursue damages for the revenue he'd generated using my trademark. It would be satisfying in a primal way, a chance to prove that his success had been built on a foundation that belonged to me, but it would also mean more legal battles, more time spent fighting with my ex-husband, more energy devoted to looking backward instead of moving forward. I unlocked my apartment door and was greeted by the familiar silence that had become the soundtrack of my new life. The living room was tidy in the way that spaces are when only one person uses them regularly, everything in its place because there was no one else around to create the comfortable chaos of family life.
I'd tried to make the apartment feel like home, hanging some of my favorite design pieces on the walls and arranging furniture in configurations that maximized the natural light, but it still felt like I was camping out in someone else's life.
I thought about Jessica Palmer, in her expensive dress, playing the role of the supportive girlfriend who believed in her partner's dreams. I thought about all the people in that room who'd accepted Mike's story without question, who'd assumed that his current success proved he'd been the driving force all along. But mostly I thought about Rachel, who would grow up in a world where her father was celebrated as a successful entrepreneur, and her mother was just another casualty of divorce. Rachel was smart enough to form her own opinions about what had happened between Mike and me, but she was also 15 years old, at an age where family mythology becomes part of your identity. Did I want her to inherit a story where ambition and ruthlessness were rewarded? Where the person who grabbed the most credit got to write the history books? The wine was helping to calm my nerves, but it wasn't making the decision any easier. Part of me wanted to call Sophia Martinez and ask for her advice, but I knew what she'd say. Sophia had been encouraging me to fight Mike's legal maneuvers from the beginning, arguing that he was counting on my desire to avoid conflict, to get away with increasingly brazen attempts to erase my contribution. Emma, she'd told me after the divorce was finalized, you can't negotiate with someone who's rewriting reality. At some point you have to decide whether you're going to let them get away with it. The problem was that fighting back would require energy and resources that I wasn't sure I had. Building pixel-perfect creative from scratch was already consuming most of my time and emotional bandwidth. Rachel needed stability and consistency, not a mother who was locked in ongoing legal battles with her father. And there was always the risk that challenging Mike would backfire, that his superior resources and established reputation would allow him to bury me even deeper than he already had. I walked over to the window that overlooked the small courtyard of my apartment complex, where a few residents had set up lawn chairs around a fire pit. It was the kind of modest community gathering that I'd come to appreciate since the divorce. People who weren't trying to impress anyone, just enjoying each other's company on a quiet Thursday evening. My old life had been full of networking events and business dinners and strategic socializing, always with an agenda, always with an eye toward building something bigger and more impressive. This new life was smaller, quieter, more authentic in some way, but it was also built on a foundation of defeat, on accepting that Mike's version of our story was the one that would be remembered. And standing there looking out at my neighbors, I realized that I wasn't ready to accept that yet. Not because I wanted revenge or vindication or even justice in the abstract sense, but because I wanted Rachel to grow up in a world where truth mattered, where the person who did the work got credit for the results, where being smart and patient and thorough was rewarded even when it didn't come with the drama of public confrontation. I returned to the dining table and read Mike's lawyer's letter one more time, paying careful attention to the deadline they'd given me for responding. 2 weeks, 14 days to decide whether I was going to sign away the last legal connection to the business I'd created, or whether I was going to fight for something that felt increasingly important the more I thought about it. The folder in my purse contained copies of all the documents David Chen had prepared, ready to file the moment I decided to move forward. A cease and desist letter that would immediately halt Mike's use of the Creative Spark name, a trademark infringement lawsuit that could result in significant damages and an injunction against his business operations. A detailed timeline of my creative and business development process that would make it very difficult for Mike to claim ownership of the original concept. But it also contained something else. Something that David had discovered during his research that even I hadn't known about. A renewal notice for my trademark registration that had been automatically processed 6 months ago, extending my exclusive rights to the Creative Spark name for another 10 years. Mike's lawyers might think they were dealing with an abandoned trademark that could be acquired for a minimal settlement. They had no idea that my legal position had actually gotten stronger while they'd been planning their expansion. I finished my wine and made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to sign Mike's document, and I wasn't going to be intimidated by his lawyer's threats. But I also wasn't going to rush into a legal battle without a strategy that went beyond just proving I was right. If Mike wanted to play games with legal documents and public narratives, then I was going to play those games better than he could imagine. Because while Mike had been focused on building his business empire and managing his public image, I'd been learning things about intellectual property law and trademark enforcement that he'd never bothered to understand. I'd been documenting every instance of his unauthorized use of my trademark, every client presentation that featured the Creative Spark name, every piece of marketing material that built value on a foundation I'd created. And I'd been very, very careful about the timing of my response. Mike thought he'd won the war when he'd won the divorce. He thought that possessing the business meant owning it, that controlling the narrative meant controlling the truth. But possession isn't ownership and control isn't power, and sometimes the person who appears to have lost everything is actually the one holding all the important cards. I put the lawyer's letter back in its envelope and placed it in the folder with all my other legal documents. Tomorrow I would call David Chen and tell him to proceed with filing the trademark infringement case. But tonight, I was going to get a good night's sleep, secure in the knowledge that Mike's victory celebration had been a little premature. Because while he'd been giving speeches and accepting awards and planning his expansion into new markets, he'd been building his success on a foundation that belonged to someone else, and that someone else had been paying very close attention to every detail of how he'd been using her work. The morning after the awards ceremony arrived with the kind of relentless California sunshine that made everything look deceptively optimistic. I'd slept better than I had in weeks, despite everything, and woke up with a strange sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since the divorce papers were signed. Rachel was still at Carmen's house, which gave me the luxury of drinking my coffee slowly while scrolling through the local news coverage of Mike's big night. The Riverside Business Journal had already posted their article online, complete with a photo gallery that captured every moment of Mike's triumph. There he was at the podium, gesturing confidently while delivering his speech about innovation and perseverance. There was Jessica, radiant in her designer dress, gazing up at him with what the caption described as the pride of a supportive partner. There was the moment when he'd raised his champagne glass for the toast, surrounded by the local business elite who'd gathered to celebrate his success. But what caught my attention wasn't any of the official ceremony photos. It was a candid shot that someone had posted on Instagram, tagged with the location and Creative Spark marketing solution. The image showed Mike and Brad Collins in what appeared to be a private moment during the cocktail hour, leaning close together in animated conversation. Mike's expression was different from his public face, more intense, more calculated. He was pointing at something on Brad's phone and both men looked like they were discussing something far more serious than champagne and congratulations. I screenshotted the image before continuing my search through social media posts from the event. Jessica's Instagram story was a carefully curated collection of glamour shots and inspirational quotes about supporting your partner's dream. Patricia Thompson had posted a lengthy Facebook tribute to her son's achievements, complete with baby photos and a detailed timeline of his supposed entrepreneurial journey. The narrative was consistent across every platform. Mike Thompson, visionary businessman, had overcome personal setbacks to build something extraordinary. What none of the coverage mentioned, what had been carefully edited out of every public account of the evening, was the moment I'd witnessed near the end of the night. As I'd been preparing to leave, I'd overheard a conversation between Mike and someone I didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive suit who'd introduced herself to others as a venture capitalist from Los Angeles. She'd been asking detailed questions about Creative Spark's intellectual property portfolio, specifically whether Mike owned all the trademarks and copyrights associated with the business. Mike's answer had been confident and immediate. "Everything's locked down tight," he'd told her, that familiar smile spreading across his face. "I made sure of that during the restructuring process. Clean ownership, no complications, ready for serious investment." The venture capitalist had nodded approvingly, mentioning something about a potential funding round that could help Creative Spark Marketing Solutions expand throughout Southern California. Sitting in my kitchen with my coffee growing cold, I realized that Mike's celebration wasn't just about receiving an award or gaining recognition in the local business community. It was about positioning himself for something much bigger, something that would require investors and legal due diligence, and the kind of scrutiny that would expose any cracks in his ownership claim. He wasn't just stealing credit for my work, he was preparing to monetize it on a scale that would make our original business look like a hobby project. The venture capitalist interest explained the urgency behind the legal letter I'd received. Mike's lawyers weren't just trying to clean up loose ends, They were trying to ensure that his business could withstand the kind of investigation that serious investors would require. They needed my signature on that relinquishment document, not because they were worried about my feelings or my legal rights, but because they were worried about due diligence reports and title searches, and all the other boring details that could derail a major investment opportunity. I opened my laptop and began researching the venture capital firm that the woman had mentioned. Pinnacle Growth Partners was exactly the kind of outfit that Mike would want to impress, a Los Angeles-based firm that specialized in scaling successful regional businesses into national brands. Their portfolio included several companies that had started as small operations and grown into household names through strategic investment and aggressive expansion. If Mike could convince them to invest in Creative Spark Marketing Solutions, he wouldn't just be stealing my work, he'd be turning it into the foundation of a business empire. The realization hit me with a clarity that was both infuriating and oddly liberating. This wasn't about Mike wanting to hurt me personally, or prove that he was better than I was. It was about money, pure and simple. The business I'd created had become valuable enough to attract serious investors, and Mike was positioning himself to cash in on that value while ensuring that I received none of the credit or compensation. He'd convinced himself that because he'd managed to take possession of the business during our divorce, that meant he owned everything associated with it, including the intellectual property I'd developed years before we'd even started working together. But Mike had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that because I'd been focused on the creative aspects of our business, I didn't understand the legal and financial implications of what we were building. He'd treated me like the stereotypical artist who was too dreamy and impractical to handle the business side of things. What he'd never realized was that my attention to detail and my obsession with documentation had created a paper trail that would be very difficult for him to explain away. I pulled out the folder of documents that David Chen had prepared and spread them across my dining table. The trademark registration was just the beginning. I had copies of every design iteration I'd created while developing the Creative Spark brand, complete with timestamps and version histories that proved my creative process. I had emails from potential clients who'd reached out to me personally after seeing my early portfolio work. I had bank records showing that I'd paid for the trademark registration and the initial business licenses from my personal account, before Mike and I had even discussed combining our professional effort. Most importantly, I had documentation of the systematic way Mike had excluded me from business decisions over the past 2 years. Every unanswered email, every meeting I wasn't invited to, every financial document I'd been denied access to had been carefully saved and organized. What had felt like death by 1,000 cuts at the time now looked like evidence of a deliberate strategy to push me out while positioning himself as the sole owner of our shared work. David Chen had explained that intellectual property cases often came down to who could tell the most convincing story about their creative process and business development. The legal system favored detailed documentation over emotional testimony, paper trails over personal narrative. Mike might have possession of the business assets, but I had something more valuable, proof that the foundation of his success belonged to me. I was still reviewing the documents when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sophia Martinez, and I answered on the second ring, grateful for the distraction from my increasingly dark thoughts about Mike's expansion plans. I saw the coverage of last night's award ceremony, Sophia said without preamble. Please tell me you're not sitting at home feeling sorry for yourself while that snake celebrates stealing your life's work. Sophia had never been subtle about her feelings regarding my ex-husband, but the past few months had intensified her anger to a level that sometimes made me uncomfortable. She'd taken Mike's behavior personally, as if his betrayal of me was also an attack on every woman who'd ever trusted a man with their dreams and ambitions. I'm not feeling sorry for myself, I told her, which was mostly true. I'm making plans. I described the venture capitalist conversation I'd overheard and the legal letter I'd received, watching Sophia's excitement build as she realized the implications of what Mike was trying to do. Emma, this is perfect, she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge it acquired when she was strategizing. He's not just infringing on your trademark, he's committing fraud by misrepresenting his ownership to potential investors. If he takes their money based on false claims about his intellectual property rights, That's securities fraud. We're not just talking about civil damages anymore, we're talking about federal crimes. The possibility of criminal charges added a dimension to the situation that I hadn't considered. Mike wasn't just stealing from me, he was potentially defrauding investors who trusted his claims about owning the business asset. If Pinnacle Growth Partners invested millions of dollars based on Mike's assurances about intellectual property ownership, only to discover later that a significant portion of the business was built on stolen trademarks, they wouldn't just be angry with him. They'd be legally obligated to pursue every available remedy to recover their investment. Sophia was already thinking several steps ahead, describing potential scenarios where Mike's fraud could unravel his entire business empire. The beauty of this situation, she explained, is that he's created his own trap. The bigger he grows the business, the more valuable your trademark becomes. The more investors he brings in, the more people have a financial interest in ensuring that ownership claims are legitimate. He thinks he's building success on your foundation, but he's actually building a house of cards that will collapse the moment someone discovers he doesn't own the foundation. But Sophia's enthusiasm also carried a warning that I needed to take seriously. You have to move fast though, she continued. Once he takes investor money, everything becomes more complicated. Right now, this is a dispute between you and Mike that can be resolved relatively simply. If there are investors involved, you'll be fighting a well-funded legal team that has millions of dollars at stake. After ending the call with Sophia, I sat quietly in my kitchen, staring out the window at the apartment complex courtyard where maintenance workers were trimming the oleander bushes that lined the walkways. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given the magnitude of what I was contemplating. In a few hours I could make a phone call that would set in motion a legal process that could destroy the business Mike had spent 2 years building. I could expose his fraud, reclaim my intellectual property and ensure that his investors discovered exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. The power was intoxicating in a way that scared me. For months I'd felt like Mike held all the cards that his superior resources and established reputation made him untouchable. I'd accepted that the best I could hope for was to rebuild my life from scratch while he enjoyed the fruits of our shared labor. But now I was discovering that Mike's apparent strength was actually a vulnerability, that his success made him more exposed rather than more secure. I thought about Rachel, who would be caught in the middle of whatever legal battle ensued. She loved her father despite his flaws, and she deserved to maintain that relationship regardless of what had happened between Mike and me. But she also deserved to know the truth about what had happened to our family, to understand that her mother hadn't simply failed to keep up with her father's ambition. The story that would emerge from a legal challenge would be complicated and painful, but it would be honest in a way that Mike's sanitized version of events could never be. The decision crystallized with a suddenness that surprised me. I wasn't going to sign Mike's document, and I wasn't going to wait for him to complete his investment deal before challenging his claims. I was going to file the trademark infringement case immediately, before he could further entrench his position or bring in investors who would complicate the legal landscape. Mike had celebrated his victory too early, had assumed that possession meant ownership, had believed that his ability to rewrite history meant that history itself had changed. But history is persistent, and truth has a weight that fiction can't match. Mike had built his success on a foundation that belonged to me, and now he was about to discover that foundations matter more than facades, that legal documents matter more than public narrative, and that sometimes the person who appears to have lost everything is actually the one who's been playing the longest game. I picked up my phone and dialed David Chen's office, ready to set in motion events that would teach Mike Thompson the difference between taking something and actually owning it. The call went straight to voicemail, so I left a message that was brief and decisive. David, this is Emma Rodriguez. I've made my decision about the trademark case, file everything. Today, after hanging up, I felt a strange combination of terror and relief wash over me. There would be no going back from this point. No quiet settlement that allowed both Mike and me to move forward without public confrontation. I was about to challenge not just his business practices, but the entire mythology he'd built around his entrepreneurial success. The next few months would be difficult, expensive, and emotionally draining in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. But for the first time since the divorce papers were signed, I felt like I was fighting for something that mattered more than money, or recognition, or even justice in the abstract sense. I was fighting for the truth,
for the principle that creative work belonged to the person who created it, for the idea that success should be measured by contribution rather than just possession. Mike had assumed that because he could take my work, that meant it belonged to him. He was about to learn the difference between theft and ownership, between narrative and reality, between celebrating too early and actually winning the game. The oleander bushes in the courtyard were blooming, their pink and white flowers creating a deceptively cheerful contrast to the serious decisions being made in the apartment above. Soon those flowers would fade and new ones would take their place, part of the endless cycle of growth and renewal that characterized everything in Southern California. Mike's celebration would fade too, replaced by legal documents and depositions, and the kind of scrutiny that would reveal exactly how his business empire had been built. I spent the rest of the morning organizing my documentation and preparing for the legal battle that was about to begin. Every email, every design file, every business record would become evidence in a case that would determine not just who owned the Creative Spark trademark, but who got to tell the true story of how a successful business had really been built. Mike thought he'd written the final chapter of our story when he'd won the divorce and claimed the business, but he'd only written the first act of a much longer drama, one where the person who appeared to be the victim was actually the one holding all the important cards. By noon, David Chen had returned my call and confirmed that all the paperwork would be filed before the end of business day. The cease and desist letter would be delivered to Mike's office tomorrow morning, giving him his first indication that his victory celebration had been premature. The trademark infringement lawsuit would follow within days, backed by documentation that would be very difficult for him to challenge, and if Sophia was right about the securities fraud implications, Mike's problems would extend far beyond just dealing with his ex-wife's legal claim. The game was about to change in ways that Mike couldn't have anticipated, and I was finally ready to play it to win. The cease and desist letter arrived at Mike's office on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who required a signature and photo identification before handing over the certified envelope. I know this because David Chen had arranged for documentation of the delivery, understanding that Mike's response to receiving the letter would be crucial evidence in the case we were building. What I didn't expect was how quickly that response would come, or how revealing it would be about the true scope of what Mike had been planning. My phone started ringing at 10:15 that morning, exactly 43 minutes after the courier had left Mike's office. The caller ID showed Mike's number, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. We hadn't spoken directly since the final divorce hearing 6 months earlier, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever combination of rage and manipulation he would bring to this conversation. But curiosity won over caution, and I answered on the fourth ring. "Emma." Mike's voice carried that familiar tone of barely controlled anger that I remembered from our worst fights during the marriage. "We need to talk now." There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the months of silence between us, just the assumption that his urgency automatically became my priority. It was such a perfectly Mike approach to communication that I almost smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "I'm sorry, Mike, but I think you need to speak with your attorney," I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. "David Chen has advised me not to discuss the trademark matter directly with you." This wasn't entirely true. David had said I could speak with Mike if I wanted to, but that I should be extremely careful about what I said and how I said it. Everything from this point forward could potentially be used as evidence in court. "Cut the bullshit." Mike's voice was rising, the veneer of calm control already cracking. "You know this is ridiculous. You can't seriously think you own the name of my business. We built Creative Spark together, and you got your settlement in the divorce. You can't come back now and try to take more just because you're struggling to make it on your own." The irony of his accusation was almost overwhelming. Mike was accusing me of trying to take something that belonged to him when the entire legal action was based on his theft of something that belonged to me. But his choice of words revealed something important. He was framing this as a personal attack motivated by jealousy and financial desperation, rather than a legitimate legal claim based on documented ownership. It was exactly the kind of narrative strategy that had worked for him during the divorce proceedings. "Mike, I registered the Creative Spark trademark in 2019, before we even started working together," I said, abandoning David's advice about not discussing the case. "The documentation is all public record. You can verify it yourself through the USPTO database." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and I imagined him at his desk in the office that used to be ours, surrounded by the success he'd built on my foundation. That's ancient history, Mike shot back, but there was something different in his voice now, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. We were married when you filed that trademark. Community property laws mean I had equal ownership of everything you created during our relationship. My lawyers have already confirmed that your divorce settlement covers any claims you might think you have. But I could hear the doubt creeping into his argument, the way his voice got slightly higher when he was trying to convince himself as much as the person he was talking to. Mike had always been better at projecting confidence than actually feeling it, and right now he sounded like someone who was realizing that his legal position might not be as solid as he'd assumed. Your lawyers might want to check their research, I said, feeling a surge of satisfaction at the tremor of uncertainty I could detect in his breathing. Community property laws don't apply to intellectual property that was created before the marriage and registered independently, especially when the other spouse's name doesn't appear anywhere on the legal documents. This was information that David Chen had verified thoroughly, understanding that Mike's attorneys would try to use California's community property statutes to challenge my ownership claim. The silence on Mike's end of the line stretched for almost 30 seconds, long enough for me to hear office sounds in the background, phones ringing, conversations in the hallway, the normal bustle of a successful business operation. It was the sound of 12 people working in jobs that existed because of the trademark I'd registered 5 years earlier, building value on a foundation that Mike had never legally owned. This is insane, Emma, Mike finally said, but the bluster was gone from his voice, replaced by something that sounded almost like pleading. You're going to destroy everything we built together over some technicality. You're going to put 12 people out of work because you're bitter about the divorce. It was a masterful attempt at manipulation, trying to make me feel guilty for enforcing my legal rights by framing the consequences as harm to innocent employees. But Mike's concern for his employees was remarkably selective. During our marriage, he'd routinely talked about workers as overhead costs that needed to be minimized rather than human beings whose livelihoods deserved protection. His sudden transformation into a champion of working people was transparently strategic, designed to make me appear selfish and vindictive rather than someone seeking to reclaim stolen property. Mike, you had 2 years to negotiate a licensing agreement or buy the trademark from me, I pointed out. You chose instead to pretend it didn't exist and build your expansion plans on intellectual property you don't own. The consequences of that decision are yours to manage. I was proud of how calm I sounded, how completely I'd avoided the emotional manipulation that Mike was attempting. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there, with Mike cycling through the standard repertoire of accusations and threats that had characterized our worst marital argument.
I let him vent for several minutes, taking notes on the things he said that might be useful for David Chen to review. Mike's anger was revealing information about his business plans that we hadn't been able to discover through public records. He mentioned the Pinnacle Growth Partners investment deal twice, confirming that serious money was at stake. He referenced expansion plans that would take Creative Spark marketing solutions into Arizona and Nevada markets. Most importantly, he made several statements about his ownership of business assets that would be very difficult to reconcile with the documented timeline of my trademark registration. When Mike finally exhausted his repertoire of accusations, I said something that brought the conversation to an abrupt halt. Mike, you should know that I've been documenting every instance of your unauthorized use of my trademark for the past 18 months, every client presentation, every piece of marketing material, every social media post that builds value on the Creative Spark name. The damages calculation is going to be substantial. The silence that followed was different from his earlier pause, deeper and more shocked. I could practically hear him processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. Mike had assumed that my legal action was a desperate attempt to grab some piece of his success, motivated by emotion rather than strategy. The idea that I'd been systematically building a case for over a year, documenting his infringement with the patience and thoroughness that had always characterized my work, was clearly something he hadn't considered. "You've been spying on me?" he finally asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. It was such a perfectly Mike response, framing my protection of my own intellectual property as a violation of his privacy. He genuinely seemed to believe that once he'd taken possession of the business, I'd lost any right to monitor how my trademark was being used. "Mike, everything I've documented is public information," I explained patiently. Your website, your social media accounts, your client testimonials, your press coverage. You've been using my trademark openly and extensively, building your reputation and client base on intellectual property you never owned. I didn't have to spy on you, I just had to pay attention. The call ended shortly after that, with Mike promising that his lawyers would be in touch, and warning me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But there was something defeated in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of the legal problem he'd created for himself. Mike had built his entire business strategy on the assumption that possession equaled ownership, that his ability to control the narrative meant he controlled the underlying reality. Within an hour of hanging up, I received a call from David Chen with an update that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Mike's attorney had already contacted David's office, not with threats or counterclaims, but with a request for a settlement conference. They wanted to discuss mutually acceptable terms for resolving the trademark dispute, without the expense and publicity of protracted litigation. "Emma, this is exactly what we hoped would happen," David explained, barely containing his excitement. "When the other side immediately requests settlement discussions, it means they've reviewed the case and realized their position is weak. Mike's lawyers have obviously done their research and discovered that your ownership claims are rock solid." But David also warned me that the settlement discussions would likely be complicated by factors beyond just the trademark dispute. Mike's expansion plans, his investor relationships, and his existing client contracts would all need to be considered in any agreement we reach. "The question isn't whether you'll win," David said. "The question is how much you're willing to accept to resolve this quickly versus how much you might win if we go to trial." The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week, giving both sides time to prepare their positions and develop realistic negotiation parameters. David spent several hours with me reviewing the different scenarios we might encounter, from a simple licensing agreement that would allow Mike to continue using the name in exchange for ongoing royalties, to a complete buyout that would transfer all trademark rights to him for a substantial lump sum payment. But there was a third option that David mentioned almost casual and that hadn't occurred to me until he brought it up. I could refuse to license or sell the trademark to Mike at all, forcing him to rebrand his entire business and potentially creating serious problems with his investor relationships. "It's the nuclear option," David explained. "You'd be exercising your legal rights to the fullest extent, but it would also mean maximum disruption to his business operations." The idea of forcing Mike to abandon the Creative Spark name entirely was appealing in a way that probably wasn't entirely healthy. After 18 months of watching him build success on my work while erasing my contributions from the story, the prospect of making him start over with a new brand felt like poetic justice. But it would also mean prolonged legal battles, ongoing hostility that would affect Rachel, and the destruction of a business that employed 12 people who had nothing to do with Mike's decision to steal my intellectual property. Over the weekend, I found myself cycling through all the possible outcomes, trying to balance my desire for vindication against my need to move forward with my own life. Rachel spent Saturday afternoon with me, and I was struck by how mature and perceptive she'd become during the months since the divorce. She didn't ask directly about the legal situation with her father, but she made several comments that suggested she understood more about the family dynamics than I'd given her credit for. "Mom, you seem different lately," she said while we were making dinner together. "More like yourself, if that makes sense. You've seemed sad for such a long time, but now you seem, I don't know, stronger." Rachel was 15, old enough to have opinions about adult situations, but young enough to express them with the kind of directness that adults had learned to avoid. I thought carefully about how to respond, wanting to be honest without burdening her with details she didn't need to carry. "I've been working through some difficult decisions about the business your father and I used to run together," I finally said. "I'm trying to make sure that the things I created are properly credited and protected." Rachel nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested she'd been thinking about these issues more than I'd realized. "Dad always talks about how he built the business by himself," she said quietly. "But I remember when you used to work on design projects every night after dinner. I remember you talking about trademarks and business names and all that stuff." It was a moment of validation that hit me harder than any legal document could have. The settlement conference took place the following Thursday in a conference room at David Chen's office, chosen because it was neutral territory that wouldn't give either side a psychological advantage. Mike arrived with 2 attorneys, a sign that he was taking the legal threat seriously, while I had David and a paralegal who specialized in intellectual property documentation. Mike looked different than he had at the awards ceremony just 2 weeks earlier. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the kind of careful composure that people adopt when they're trying to control a situation that's spiraling beyond their management. He nodded briefly when I entered the room, but didn't attempt any of the false friendliness that had characterized our interactions during the divorce proceedings. The negotiations lasted almost 6 hours, with multiple breaks for private consultations and legal research. Mike's attorneys had obviously done their homework, confirming that my trademark registration was valid and that their client's use of the name constituted clear infringement. But they also presented a compelling case for why a punitive resolution would be counterproductive for everyone involved. The business Mike had built was genuinely successful, generating annual revenue that exceeded anything I'd imagined when I'd first registered the Creative Spark trademark. His client relationships were strong, his expansion plans were well-researched, and his employees were talented professionals who'd contributed significantly to the company's growth. Destroying all of that to prove a legal point would satisfy my desire for justice, but it wouldn't serve any larger purpose. More importantly, Mike's attorneys revealed information about the Pinnacle Growth Partners investment deal that changed my understanding of what was really at stake. The venture capital firm wasn't just interested in providing expansion funding, they were evaluating Creative Spark Marketing Solutions as a potential acquisition target that could become the foundation of a much larger marketing services company. If the deal went through as planned, Mike's business could be worth tens of millions of dollars within 5 years. The final settlement agreement was more generous than anything I'd dared to hope for when I'd first contacted David Chen. Mike would purchase my trademark rights for a sum that reflected not just the current value of the business, but also the projected value based on his expansion plans and investor relationships. I would receive ongoing consulting fees for any use of design elements I'd created, ensuring that my contributions to the business's foundation would be financially recognized in perpetuity. Perhaps most importantly, the settlement agreement included a public acknowledgement of my role in creating the original Creative Spark concept and developing the brand identity that had become the foundation of Mike's success. It wasn't a full apology or a complete rewriting of the business's origin story, but it was official recognition that my contributions had been substantial and foundational. Mike's signature on the settlement documents was tight and controlled, the handwriting of someone who understood that he was acknowledging mistakes while securing his future. We didn't speak directly during the signing process, but there was a moment when our eyes met across the conference table, and I saw something that might have been respect mixed with the resentment I'd expected. The financial impact of the settlement was transformative in ways that extended far beyond just paying off my divorce-related debts. For the first time since the divorce, I had the resources to expand pixel-perfect creative without worrying about monthly cash flow or client payment schedule. More importantly, I had the psychological freedom that comes from knowing that my work had been properly valued and legally protected. But the real satisfaction came from something that Mike probably never realized. The settlement agreement required him to acknowledge that Creative Spark's success had been built on a foundation that belonged to someone else, that his entrepreneurial triumph had been dependent on intellectual property he'd never owned. It was a lesson in the difference between taking something and actually earning it, between possession and ownership, between narrative and truth. The awards ceremony at the Grand Ballroom had been Mike's moment of public triumph, his celebration of what he believed was a complete victory over the complications of his past. But that celebration had been built on a legal fiction that couldn't withstand scrutiny, a house of cards that collapsed the moment someone bothered to check the foundation. 6 months later, Creative Spark Marketing Solutions announced its acquisition by Pinnacle Growth Partners in a deal that valued the company at $42 million. Mike's personal share of the transaction was substantial enough to make him genuinely wealthy, but the press coverage of the deal included prominent mention of the intellectual property licensing agreements that had been necessary to complete the transaction. The business community that had celebrated his entrepreneurial success now understood that his achievement had been built on someone else's work. Rachel started her junior year of high school that fall, and she'd developed into the kind of young woman who asked thoughtful questions about business ethics and intellectual property rights. She understood, without needing detailed explanations, that success built on stolen foundations wasn't really success at all. She also understood that her mother had been patient enough to let the truth emerge on its own timeline, rather than demanding immediate vindication at the cost of everyone else's well-being. I never attended another awards ceremony for Mike's business achievements, but I followed the coverage with the kind of detached interest that comes from knowing you've been properly credited for your contribution. The story that emerged over time was more complex and more honest than the mythology Mike had originally tried to create. It acknowledged that successful businesses are usually built on collaborative foundations, that intellectual property law exists to protect creator, and that the most impressive victories are often won by the people who understand that patience and documentation matter more than public performance. The last time I saw Mike was at Rachel's high school graduation 2 years later. He was there with Jessica, who had developed into a thoughtful partner who seemed to understand the complexities of the family dynamic she'd inherited. We exchanged polite greetings and focused on celebrating Rachel's achievements, but there was an acknowledgement between us that hadn't existed before. Mike had learned something about the difference between taking credit and earning it, and I had learned something about the power that comes from protecting your work and waiting for the right moment to defend it. The Creative Spark trademark case became something of a local legend in Riverside's business community, cited as an example of why intellectual property documentation matters and why success built on stolen foundations is ultimately unsustainable. But for me, it was something simpler and more personal. Proof that truth has its own weight, that patience can be more powerful than confrontation, and that sometimes the person who appears to have lost everything is actually the one who's been holding all the important cards. 3 years had passed since the settlement conference, and I was standing in the glass-walled conference room of my new offices, looking out over the Riverside skyline while my team prepared for our biggest client presentation yet. Pixel Perfect Creative had grown from a one-woman operation working out of my apartment to a full-service design agency with 8 employees and a client roster that included some of the most innovative companies in Southern California. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were now competing directly with Creative Spark Marketing Solutions for many of the same contracts, and winning more often than not. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The settlement money from Mike had provided the foundation, but building a sustainable business required the same attention to detail and strategic thinking that had protected my trademark rights in the first place. I'd learned to hire slowly and carefully, choosing team members who understood that good design work required both creative vision and business intelligence. Every employee contract included clear intellectual property provisions. Every project included detailed documentation of creative processes, and every client relationship was built on transparent communication about ownership and usage rights. Sarah Kim, my lead designer and unofficial business partner, knocked on the conference room door and gestured toward the presentation materials spread across the mahogany table. "Emma, the Henderson Industries team just arrived," she said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled excitement that comes with landing a potential 7-figure contract. "They're in the main conference room reviewing our portfolio, and Jennifer is walking them through the brand strategy proposals." Henderson Industries was exactly the kind of client that validated everything I'd been building toward. They were a mid-sized manufacturing company looking to modernize their entire brand identity, from logo design to digital marketing strategy to customer experience optimization. The project would require 6 months of intensive work and a team of specialists, but it would also establish Pixel Perfect Creative as a major player in the regional marketing landscape. More importantly, it would prove that success built on authentic foundations was more sustainable than success built on stolen intellectual property. The presentation went better than I'd dared to hope. The Henderson Industries executives were impressed not just with our creative concepts, but with the detailed project management systems and intellectual property protections we'd built into every aspect of our workflow. They'd obviously done their research on our company, and they specifically mentioned their appreciation for working with a firm that had clear ownership structures and transparent business practice. It was a not-so-subtle reference to some of the complications they'd experienced with other marketing agencies, complications that I suspected might have involved Creative Spark Marketing Solutions. After the Henderson Industries team left, promising a decision within a week, my staff gathered in the main conference room for our monthly team meeting. It was a ritual I'd instituted early in the company's growth, partly for practical business reasons,
but mostly because I wanted to create the kind of collaborative environment that I'd never been able to achieve during my partnership with Mike. Everyone had a voice in major decisions, everyone understood how their work contributed to the company's success, and everyone shared in the financial rewards when we exceeded our quarterly target. Jennifer Martinez, our newest hire and a recent graduate from UC Riverside's business program, raised her hand during the discussion of new project opportunities. "Emma, I've been researching potential expansion into the Arizona market, and I think we should consider opening a satellite office in Phoenix," she said, pulling out a folder of research materials she'd compiled on her own initiative. "The competitive landscape is less saturated than here in California, and several of our existing clients have mentioned needing marketing support for their Arizona operation." The suggestion was exactly the kind of strategic thinking I encouraged from my team, but it also carried personal resonance that Jennifer couldn't have known about. Arizona expansion had been one of Mike's major goals during the Pinnacle Growth Partners negotiations, part of his vision for transforming Creative Spark Marketing Solutions into a regional powerhouse. The fact that my independently built company was now considering the same growth strategy felt like a validation of the business instincts that Mike had dismissed during our marriage. But there was also a more immediate practical consideration that made Jennifer's suggestion particularly timely. Creative Spark Marketing Solutions had been struggling over the past year, losing several major clients to competitors who offered more innovative approaches to brand development and digital marketing. The business press had been speculating about internal management problems and strategic disagreements between Mike and his Pinnacle Growth Partners overseer. Industry rumors suggested that the acquisition hadn't delivered the growth projections that had justified the original $42 million valuation. I'd been following Creative Spark's challenges with the kind of professional interest that any business owner pays to their competitors, but also with a more personal curiosity about how Mike was handling the pressure of running a company under external investor scrutiny. The confident entrepreneur who'd accepted awards and given inspirational speeches about vision and perseverance was now answering to venture capitalists who measured success in quarterly profit margins and market share percentage. It was a different kind of stress than anything he'd experienced during our partnership, when the biggest pressures came from client deadlines and cash flow management. The monthly team meeting concluded with Jennifer volunteering to develop a detailed feasibility study for Arizona expansion, including market analysis, competitive research, and financial projections. I was consistently impressed by the initiative and business intelligence that my employees brought to their work, qualities that seemed to emerge naturally when people felt valued and properly compensated for their contribution. It was a stark contrast to the hierarchical management style that Mike had favored, where strategic decisions were made at the top and implemented by employees who weren't consulted about their feasibility or effectiveness. After the meeting ended, I stayed in the conference room to review the Henderson Industries materials and prepare for the follow-up conversations that would determine whether we'd won the contract. The portfolio we'd presented included examples of work from our first 3 years of operation, showcasing a range of projects that demonstrated both creative excellence and strategic business thinking. Looking through the materials, I was struck by how much the quality of our work had improved as we'd grown, how the collaborative environment I'd fostered had produced results that exceeded what any individual designer could have achieved working alone. The phone call from Henderson Industries came the next morning, earlier than I'd expected and with better news than I'd dared to hope for. Not only had we won the contract, but they wanted to expand the scope of work to include developing marketing strategies for their subsidiary companies as well. The total project value would be close to $2 million spread over 18 months. Making it the largest contract in Pixel Perfect Creative's history and positioning us for the kind of growth that would require serious expansion planning. Sarah Kim was the first person I called with the news, partly because she'd been instrumental in developing the creative concepts that had impressed the Henderson Industries team, but mostly because she'd become the kind of business partner that I'd always hoped to find. Sarah understood that successful collaboration required both creative vision and business intelligence, that protecting intellectual property was just as important as developing it, and that sustainable growth required careful attention to legal and financial details that many creative professionals preferred to ignore. "Emma, this is incredible," Sarah said, her excitement bubbling through the phone line. This contract is going to change everything for us. We'll be able to hire the additional staff we've been talking about, maybe even consider that Arizona expansion Jennifer proposed. But more than that, it's validation that we've built something real here, something that can compete with anyone in the market. The Henderson Industries contract also created an opportunity to demonstrate something that had become increasingly important to me over the past 3 years, that business success built on ethical foundations was more sustainable than success built on shortcuts and stolen intellectual property. Every aspect of our work for Henderson Industries would be documented and properly attributed. Every creative element would be clearly owned by either Pixel Perfect Creative or our client, and every team member who contributed to the project would be appropriately credited and compensated. It was a business philosophy that had emerged from my experience with Mike's theft of my trademark, but it had evolved into something broader and more positive than just protecting against intellectual property. Creating clear ownership structures and transparent business practices had attracted both employees and clients who valued integrity over expedience. People who understood that sustainable success required building on solid foundations, rather than cutting corners or taking credit for other people's work. The news about our Henderson Industries contract reached the local business community quickly, partly through formal press releases, but mostly through the informal networks that connected Riverside's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Within a week, I'd received congratulatory messages from dozens of colleagues, clients, and even competitors who recognized the significance of landing such a substantial project. But the message that surprised me most came from an unexpected source, Patricia Thompson, Mike's mother, who sent a handwritten note expressing her admiration for what I'd accomplished since the divorce. "Dear Emma," the note began in Patricia's careful cursive handwriting. "I wanted to congratulate you on your recent business success and to acknowledge that I may have misjudged your capabilities during your marriage to Mike. It's clear that you've built something impressive and sustainable, and I respect the integrity with which you've conducted yourself throughout some very difficult circumstances. I hope you'll accept my belated recognition of your contributions to the family business, and my apologies for not seeing your value more clearly at the time." The letter was only a few paragraphs long, but it represented a level of acknowledgement that I'd never expected to receive from Mike's family. Patricia had always been protective of her son to a fault, quick to blame external factors when things went wrong and slow to recognize his responsibility for problems in his relationships and business dealing. Her willingness to reconsider her assessment of my capabilities suggested that the truth about Mike's business practices had become too obvious to ignore, even for someone predisposed to defend him. I was still processing Patricia's unexpected letter when Rachel called with news that was both exciting and slightly complicated. She'd been accepted to UCLA's business program for the following fall with a partial scholarship that would cover most of her tuition costs. But she'd also been offered an internship position at a marketing firm in Los Angeles, one that would provide valuable experience, but also require her to work closely with some of the same people who'd been involved in Mike's business expansion effort. "Mom, I know this might be weird given everything that's happened with you and Dad," Rachel said, her voice carrying the careful diplomacy that had become her default approach to navigating between her parents' complicated relationship. "But I really think this internship could be important for my career development. The firm does the kind of strategic consulting work that I want to specialize in, and they've specifically mentioned that they're interested in my perspective on intellectual property issues and business ethics." Rachel's maturity and business intelligence had been evident since middle school, but her ability to understand the complexities of the situation between Mike and me had grown more sophisticated as she'd gotten older.
The internship opportunity also represented something that I hadn't fully anticipated when I'd first decided to challenge Mike's use of my trademark, that the principles involved in our dispute would become part of a larger conversation about intellectual property rights and business ethics in creative industries. Rachel's generation of business students was learning about these issues in ways that my generation had largely ignored. Understanding that protecting creative work and ensuring proper attribution weren't just legal technicalities, but fundamental requirements for sustainable business practices. I encouraged Rachel to pursue the internship opportunity, understanding that her career development was more important than any residual awkwardness between her parents. But I also used the conversation as an opportunity to share some of the lessons I'd learned about documentation, intellectual property protection, and the importance of establishing clear ownership structures before problems arose. Rachel listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood these weren't just abstract business concepts, but practical tools that could protect her own work throughout her career. The Henderson Industries project officially launched 2 weeks later, with a kickoff meeting that brought together representatives from both companies to establish timelines, communication protocols, and creative parameters. The collaborative energy in the room reminded me of the best aspects of my early partnership with Mike, when we'd been focused on building something meaningful rather than protecting territory or managing competing egos. But there was also a level of professional sophistication and legal clarity that we'd never achieved in our marriage-based business relationship. Every aspect of the Henderson Industries project was governed by detailed contracts that specified intellectual property ownership, usage rights, and creative attribution requirements. It was the kind of legal foundation that I'd learned to insist upon after my experience with Mike's trademark theft, but it had also become standard practice in my industry as more creative professionals recognized the importance of protecting their work. The business community had evolved to expect these protections, understanding that clear ownership structures benefited everyone involved in collaborative creative projects. As the Henderson Industries project progressed through its initial phases, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from that devastating awards ceremony 3 years earlier to this position of genuine business success and professional recognition. The trademark settlement had provided the financial foundation, but building a sustainable company had required developing skills and perspectives that I'd never needed during my partnership with Mike. I'd learned to hire and manage employees, to develop strategic business plans, to navigate complex client relationships, and to protect intellectual property in ways that fostered collaboration rather than creating barriers. Most importantly, I'd learned that success built on authentic foundations was more satisfying and more sustainable than success built on shortcuts or stolen intellectual property. The employees who worked for Pixel Perfect Creative understood exactly how their contributions fitted into our overall business strategy, and they shared in the financial rewards when our projects exceeded expectations. The clients who hired us knew that they were working with a firm that respected intellectual property rights and maintained transparent business practices. The competitors who lost contracts to us recognized that we'd earned our success through superior work rather than political maneuvering or cost-cutting measures that compromised quality. The validation I'd been seeking during those dark months after the divorce hadn't come from legal victories or financial settlements, though both had been important milestones in my recovery. It had come from building something that reflected my values and capability, from creating a business environment where good work was properly recognized and fairly compensated, from demonstrating that ethical business practices were competitive advantages rather than noble gestures that limited profitability. 6 months into the Henderson Industries project, Pixel Perfect Creative was invited to present our work at the annual Riverside Business Summit, the same event where Mike had received his Entrepreneur of the Year award 3 years early. The invitation came with a request to speak specifically about intellectual property protection and business ethics in the creative industries, topics that had become central to my company's reputation and competitive positioning. Standing at the podium in the same Grand Ballroom where I'd watched Mike celebrate his stolen success, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The audience included many of the same people who'd applauded Mike's speech about vision and perseverance, but they were now listening to a different kind of success story, one that emphasized collaboration over competition, documentation over assumption, and long-term relationship building over short-term profit maximization. My presentation focused on the practical steps that creative professionals could take to protect their intellectual property while fostering collaborative business relationships. I discussed the importance of clear contracts, detailed documentation, and transparent communication about ownership and usage rights. But I also emphasized that these protections weren't barriers to creativity or collaboration. They were foundations that allowed creative work to flourish by ensuring that everyone involved understood their roles, responsibilities, and rewards. The response to my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with several audience members approaching me afterward to discuss potential consulting relationships or partnership opportunities. But the conversation that meant the most to me came from a young entrepreneur who'd been in the audience, a woman about Rachel's age who was just starting her own design business and wanted advice about protecting her intellectual property while building client relationships. Rodriguez, she said, her voice carrying the kind of nervous enthusiasm that I remembered from my own early business development effort. I've been following your company's success for the past year, and I really admire how you've built a business that prioritizes both creative excellence and ethical practices. I'm just starting out, and I want to make sure I establish the right foundations from the beginning. Could you recommend some resources for learning about intellectual property protection and business ethics in the creative industry? Her question reminded me that the lessons I'd learned from Mike's betrayal had applications far beyond my own situation, that the principles of intellectual property protection and business ethics were fundamental skills that every creative professional needed to understand. I spent almost an hour talking with her about trademark registration, contract development, and documentation practices, sharing resources and referrals that could help her build a sustainable business on solid legal and ethical foundation. Driving home from the business summit that evening, I realized that the story of my trademark case had become something larger than just a personal victory over Mike's betrayal. It had become part of a broader conversation about how creative professionals could protect their work while building collaborative business relationships, how intellectual property rights could foster innovation rather than stifling it, and how business success built on ethical foundations was more sustainable than success built on shortcuts or stolen credit. The awards ceremony where Mike had celebrated his supposed triumph had been 3 years and a lifetime ago. His business was now struggling under the weight of external investor pressure and internal management problems, while mine was thriving through organic growth based on excellent work and satisfied clients. But more importantly, the principles that had guided my response to his betrayal had become the foundation of a business philosophy that attracted employees, clients, and collaborators who shared similar values. Rachel graduated from high school that spring with academic honors and a clear sense of her professional goals. Her internship experience had reinforced her interest in business consulting, particularly in areas related to intellectual property and business ethics. She'd seen firsthand how companies that prioritized short-term profits over long-term relationship building often struggled to maintain sustainable growth, while companies that invested in clear communication and transparent business practices typically outperformed their competitors over time. Mom, I've been thinking about your trademark case and everything that happened with Dad's business, Rachel said during our celebration dinner after her graduation ceremony. I know it was really hard for you at the time, but I think what you learned from that experience has made you a better business owner and a better person. You didn't just win a legal battle, you figured out how to build something that reflects your values and creates value for everyone involved. Her observation captured something that I'd been feeling but hadn't quite articulated, that the real victory hadn't been financial or legal but personal and professional. I'd learned to trust my instincts about documentation and intellectual property protection, to insist on clear communication about ownership and attribution, and to build business relationships based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics or personal manipulation. The Henderson Industries project concluded successfully that fall, with results that exceeded everyone's expectations and led to additional contracts with their subsidiary company. Pixel Perfect Creative's revenue for the year was almost 10 times what it had been during my final year of partnership with Mike. But more importantly, every dollar had been earned through legitimate work that was properly attributed and fairly compensated. The Arizona expansion that Jennifer had proposed became a reality the following spring, with a Phoenix office that specialized in serving manufacturing and technology companies throughout the Southwest. The satellite operation was successful from its first month, attracting clients who appreciated our combination of creative excellence and business professionalism. Within 6 months, the Phoenix office was generating enough revenue to justify additional expansion into New Mexico and Colorado markets. By the 4th anniversary of my trademark settlement with Mike, Pixel Perfect Creative had become one of the most respected marketing agencies in the region, with a reputation for ethical business practices that attracted both top-tier employees and high-value clients. We'd been featured in national trade publications as an example of how creative firms could scale their operations while maintaining their founding value. And I'd been invited to speak at conferences throughout the country about intellectual property protection and business ethics in the creative industry. The success felt different from anything I'd experienced during my partnership with Mike, more sustainable and more satisfying because it was built on foundations that I could trust completely. Every employee understood exactly how their work contributed to our overall success. Every client knew that they were working with a firm that respected intellectual property rights and maintained transparent business practices, and every project was documented in ways that would protect everyone's interest regardless of how business relationships might evolve over time. Mike's business, meanwhile, had been acquired by a larger marketing conglomerate in a transaction that industry observers described as a distressed sale. The original Pinnacle Growth Partners investment had never delivered the projected returns, and Creative Spark Marketing Solutions had struggled to compete effectively in an increasingly sophisticated market. The final sale price was reportedly less than half of the original acquisition cost, representing a significant loss for the venture capital investors who'd been attracted by Mike's confident promises about expansion and profitability. I learned about Mike's business difficulties through industry publications, rather than personal communication, and I felt no satisfaction in his struggle. The competitive marketplace had simply revealed the difference between success built on solid foundations and success built on stolen intellectual property and investor speculation. Mike's confidence and charisma had been sufficient to attract initial investment and media attention, but they weren't sufficient to sustain a business that lacked the operational excellence and strategic clarity that long-term success required. The final chapter of our story came in an unexpected form, a LinkedIn message from Mike himself sent on a quiet Tuesday morning almost 5 years after our trademark settlement. The message was brief and professional, but it carried an acknowledgement that I'd never expected to receive. "Emma," he wrote, "I've been following Pixel Perfect Creative's success over the past few years, and I wanted to congratulate you on building something truly impressive. I know our business relationship ended badly, and I've come to understand that I made serious mistakes in how I handled our partnership and intellectual property issues. Your success has been well earned, and I respect what you've accomplished. I hope you and Rachel are doing well." The message was careful and measured, obviously written after considerable thought about tone and content. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any formal legal settlement could have provided. Mike had finally recognized that my contributions to our original partnership had been substantial and foundational, that my subsequent success hadn't been luck or vindictiveness, but the natural result of skills and insights that he'd undervalued during our marriage. I didn't respond to Mike's message immediately, taking time to consider whether any response was necessary or appropriate. Eventually I sent a brief reply thanking him for his acknowledgement and wishing him well in his future endeavor. There was no point in revisiting old grievances or rehashing ancient arguments. Both of us had moved forward with our lives, and both of us had learned lessons that would influence our future business relationship. Rachel started her junior year at UCLA that fall, majoring in business administration with a focus on intellectual property law and business ethics. Her academic work was informed by the real-world experiences she'd observed in our family, and her professors often used her insights about documentation and relationship management as examples for other students. She'd found her calling in helping creative professionals protect their work while building sustainable business relationships, carrying forward the lessons learned from both her parents' successes and failures. Standing in my office on a quiet Friday afternoon, looking out over the riverside skyline and the thriving business district where Pixel Perfect Creative had found its place, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating awards ceremony to this position of genuine professional fulfillment. The trademark case had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had come from learning to build success on foundations that I could trust completely, foundations built on honest work, clear communication, and respect for everyone's contribution. The awards ceremony where Mike had celebrated his stolen triumph had been a moment of profound humiliation,
but it had also been the beginning of a journey that led to something better than anything I could have imagined during those dark months after the divorce. I'd learned that victory isn't always immediate and obvious, that the most important battles are often won through patience and documentation rather than confrontation and drama, and that success built on authentic foundations is always more satisfying than success built on shortcuts or stolen credit. The sun was setting over the San Bernardino Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that made the entire valley look like a canvas created by someone who understood that the most beautiful art comes from patient attention to detail and respect for the natural foundations that make everything else possible. It was the perfect metaphor for a business philosophy that had been tested by betrayal and validated by authentic success, a reminder that sometimes the person who appears to have lost everything is actually the one who's been building something better all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.